Committee hearing on community development and insurance hearing is now called to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on the subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. As a reminder, I ask all members to keep themselves muted when they are not being recognized. Staff have been instructed not to mute members except where a member is not being recognized and there is inadvertent background noise. Members are also reminded that they may only participate in one remote proceeding at a time. If you are participating today, please keep your camera on. And if you choose to attend a different remote proceeding, please turn your camera off. This hearing is entitled Flexible Federal Funding, Examining the Community Development Block Grant Program and its impact on addressing local challenges. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. The Community Development Block Grant Program was originally authorized under Title I of the Housing Community Development Act of 1974 and signed into law by President Gerald R. Ford. It is the federal government's largest and most widely available source of financial assistance to support state and local efforts in government-related neighborhood revitalization, including housing, rehabilitation, and economic development activities. At the time of its authorization, CDBG ushered a new approach to addressing community need at the local level, one that provided flexibility to communities to address challenges without a plethora of federal mandates. The flexibility of CDBG is what separates it from most other federal programs in that, while targeting funds toward the benefit of low to moderate income persons, the program leaves it to states and local jurisdictions to tailor programs and set priorities that are best suited for their particular communities. Urban, suburban, and rural areas all receive CDBG program funding. CDBG funds reach every state and are accessible to all congressional districts and insular areas. Most Americans do not need to look far to see the critical role that CDBG plays in supporting low to moderate income Americans and communities. In my congressional district, the most recent CDBG accomplishments report for Kansas City, Missouri, of which I'm the former mayor, details critical housing, public services, and public improvement projects which benefited over 180,000 of our citizens. Roughly half of Kansas City's CDBG expenditure were coded as housing, and CDBG funds helped to rehabilitate hundreds of single-unit residential homes targeted toward stabilizing homes in low to moderate income urban core neighborhoods. In Independence, Missouri, an entitlement city I also represent, and the birthplace of former President Harry Truman, thousands more benefited from critical and ostensibly life-saving public services. CDBG has been used for partnerships with nonprofit and homeless service providers, neighborhood stabilization and public improvements, affordable housing and economic development, among other important purposes. The story of CDBG in my district is true in localities across the nation. Ask governors, county executives, mayors, and other stakeholders, urban or rural Democrat or Republican, and they will tell you that the CDBG program is an instrumental piece of community development efforts. In many cases, CDBG funds are combined with other sources of funding and are the difference in whether a community development project moves forward. Since 1975, CDBG has assisted millions of low to moderate income Americans. And with that, I will end my comments and recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much, Chairman Cleaver. I want to start by saying how much I appreciate how you have drawn from your experience as mayor to dive deep into community development block grant, but also the program and to provide leadership on needed reforms. And I want to emphasize some reforms. You and I have talked about how members of Congress can get their concerns addressed. Also, there's some concerns about some of the non-entitlement small areas, jurisdictions that may need to I guess, apply for entitlement, et cetera. But I'm worried about them because I've been hearing from some of our members about that. And so I am very pleased that CBDG serves as an important, flexible funding resource for communities across the country, helping to build homes, repair streets, support local small businesses, and provide meals to seniors. I appreciate the leadership you're taking on examining ways to strengthen and expand this important program. I've long supported CDBG. I will continue to support CDBG, not just increasing funds, but with these reforms that you and I, again, have talked about. So I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver. It's good to have this hearing. We haven't had a hearing on CDBG in many, many years. I'm also delighted to join you. We've got the band back together again. I'm proud to be your ranking member on this subcommittee for housing and insurance, and look forward to working with you and the rest of our subcommittee members. The CDBG program is an important and popular program at HUD, certainly over the past 5 decades. As a regular appropriation of around $3.5 billion, CDBG is the 4th largest program at HUD. There are over 1,200 so-called entitlement communities that receive direct HUD funding from the CDBG program each year. And if you know anything about how local governments operate, they very much enjoy financial flexibility. However, despite its long history and robust annual funding, we rarely talk about CDBG much in this committee. Now, I will say my good friend from Houston, Al Green, and Ann Wagner of St. Louis did a good job in looking at the CDBG disaster funding in the last Congress and made some improvements. But as a general matter, we do not pay enough attention and do enough oversight over this program. In fact, the last hearing on CDBG before House Financial Services dates back 15 years to 2006. And even at that, it was a field hearing, more to discuss local benefits of the program and less talk about fundamental statutory issues like the funding allocation formula, project prioritization, and other technicalities that make up this program. That might seem innocuous at times, but I think this hearing will demonstrate that it's time to review this program and look at the fundamental issues around the definitions at CDBG. For example, defining the housing stock that predate 1940 is still a measurement going back to 1974, when this program rolled up all the Johnson and Nixon neighborhood revitalization programs into one block grant. So that single anchor analytic really skews who gets this money. To put a fine point on it, I first realized how impactful that was when I looked at Cleveland, Ohio, when I was there in 2016. In 1940, during World War II, Cleveland had a population that played a different role in the economy than it does now. They had about 875,000 people in Cleveland back in the 1930s and 1940s, and now it's about 380,000, and that housing stock reflects that. As such, the CDBG funding could evolve, but I'm afraid that has not been the case over the years. So I'd say this program is ripe for review and reform to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not only being used for necessary projects to address the actual needs of low, moderate income communities. And we'll no doubt hear about this today. There are many positive outcomes from the CDBG program, but it's worth remembering that there's evidence of poor spending choices, just like in any other big government program, when the program has loose strings and insufficient oversight. Criticism of the CDBG program generally centers around poorly targeted funding to low, moderate income communities, creating lackluster results despite flexibility in funding. In my view, necessary oversight of these types of programs are critical to learn what and how programs have fallen short of expectations, and occasionally kick the tires to see if all the parts are actually working as Congress intended. So today, I believe there are 3 main areas of possible concern that are worthy of further explanation, and we thank our witnesses for being here. First, as I mentioned, how the CDBG funding formula is set in statute. It's woefully out of date. Number 2, CDBG rules can sometimes allow too much flexibility, which can deprioritize important projects relative to lesser ones, even if the lesser ones are a allowable resource or use. And thirdly, how CDBG can overlook the needs of our smallest rural communities as they get lumped in with other communities that are too small to qualify for entitlement community status. I look forward to the discussion today. I thank my chairman for convening the hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The ranking member yields back. Today, we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have with us Mayor London Breed, the mayor of the city and the county of San Francisco, California. Next, we have Mr. George Mensah, the director of the Department of Housing and Public Development and Community Development in the city of Miami, Florida. Next, we have Ms. Kimberly Robinson, the executive director of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. Next, we have Mr. Joseph Juraskic, I'm sorry, sir, if I mispronounced your name, an analyst in economic development policy at the Congressional Research Service. We have Mr. Salim Firth, a senior research fellow with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left. And a chime will go off at the end of your time. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony. If you hear the chime so that we can respectfully hear all of the witnesses and the committee members. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. Mayor Breed, thank you for being here. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, and good morning to everyone, and Ranking Member Hill and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you all so much for the invitation to testify before you today. I'm testifying today on behalf of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Mayors and CEOs for Housing Investment, and on behalf of the City and County of San Francisco. I'm here to talk about what San Francisco is doing to protect our most vulnerable residents and what more we can do together with the critical support of the federal government. San Francisco is a city of real disparities. We have neighborhoods of beautiful homes and incredible views that are within walking distance of people living in really challenging circumstances. Housing instability, homelessness, and income inequality are a threat to far too many of our residents. San Francisco is not alone in facing these challenges. We've seen estimates that due to the challenges caused by this pandemic, more than 30 million Americans could be at risk of being evicted. This is a looming national crisis, and it's why these community development block grants are so critical for cities like San Francisco. They provide badly needed support to face these challenges, but they also provide flexibility for us to be able to work with our communities on tailored solutions. One key example of this is our Tenants' Rights to Counsel program, which is funded by the CDBG program. Starting in 2019, we began implementing this landmark policy that all residential tenants facing eviction have a right to full scope legal representation. This program requires eviction legal assistance to provide full scope legal representation. We have seen that this full scope representation gets better results for tenants. So far, 67% of full scope clients stayed in their home as compared to 38% of those without. And among African American tenants, the rates are even higher. 80% of those who received full scope representation stayed in their homes. Those are statistics, yes, but those are lives, those are families, those are people who, if evicted, could end up homeless. It's too expensive here, and people so often have to move out of the city away from their families and communities. So many people I grew up with in the Fillmore neighborhood have left our city for this very reason. Keeping people housed in their community is essential for keeping our community strong and diverse. And now in my upcoming budget, San Francisco will fully fund the Tenant Right to Counsel program so that every tenant in need has full scope representation. This will be a dramatic difference in our city, where housing affordability is a challenge for so many, and it proves the significant impacts of these block grants. The key reason for this success is flexibility provided by CDBG funds. For San Francisco, we can fund our landmark tenant protection program to help our most vulnerable from being evicted, but a smaller community or a city in a different part of the country might have a different program to deliver on that need. We are a vast and varied country. CDBG works because it recognizes that fundamental truth. Now, while I'm proud of our ability to fund tenants' rights to counsel, the need is so much greater. COVID has exposed the already existing disparities with disproportionate impacts hitting our African American and Latino communities. And over the last 2 decades, as our population has grown, San Francisco has seen a decline in CDBG funding. We need to reverse that trend. In San Francisco, our most recent request for CDBG funding, the request for dollars exceeded the amount available by 350%. An increase in overall allocation of CDBG would not only support San Francisco, but would help every state, city, local jurisdiction that relies on these funds. I want to thank Congress for your leadership over the last year in passing critical relief packages in response to the COVID health crisis. And I especially want to thank Speaker Nancy Pelosi for her unwavering support for San Francisco and mayors across the country to ensure local governments have the resources we need, such as CDBG funds, so that we can provide the care and support our residents need and deserve. I'm urging Congress to recognize that our residents and our neighborhoods can thrive if we provide the resources and the flexibility to local communities to make decisions about supporting what's best. Thank you for your time and your continued support.
Thank you very much, Mayor Breed. Mr. Mensah, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give a presentation and your testimony. Mr. Mensah, or your microphone may not be turned on.
Ranking Member Hill and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify before you today. I'm testifying today on behalf of the National Community Development Association, which represents nearly 500 local governments that administer the community development program. NCDA is an association of people committed to assist local governments to achieve high-quality, local responsive programs for making communities better in which to live. Created in 1974, the CDBG program provides annual funding to about 1,200 states and local jurisdictions in slow areas to provide decent housing, a suitable living environment, and expand economic opportunities for low and moderate income persons. Program grantees use CDBG funding to invest in low and moderate income people and neighborhoods through a variety of activities that focus on 4 major areas: affordable housing, infrastructure, services, and economic development. While the program allows community design and implement strategies tailored to meet local needs and priorities, reforms are needed to make the program more flexible. In June 2020, NCDA formed a working group of Latinx and Black community development administrators to examine the CDBG program to make recommendations for improving program to better serve communities of color. The working group developed 5 recommendations for improving the CDBG program. The first one is increase the authorized funding level for the CDBG program. CDBG funding has diminished significantly over time. The program was authorized at $2.4 billion in 1974 and reached its highest level of $4.4 billion in 2001. That is 20 years ago. The program has remained relatively stagnant in recent years, hovering around $3.4 billion. CDBG funding has not kept pace with inflation and program need. The program has never been adjusted for inflation, even though program costs increase annually. Grantees report that requests for funds consistently outweigh available grant dollars. The number of grantees receiving CDBG funding has increased from 594 in 1975 to 1,245 today, a 47.7% increase. Immediate and long-term investment programs like CDBG will help address underinvestment in communities of color and other low-income communities. We recommend that CDBG funding be expanded significantly to meet the inflation-adjusted value of the program, estimated to be about 12.2 billion, and be adjusted annually to reflect the rise in inflation. 2, let grantees determine the public services cap. Allow grantees the discretion to decide the amount of public service dollars needed to address their community needs. The public service category within CDBG covers many important activities that support and benefit low-income communities, but is limited by a 50% cap, which means that the total amount of CDBG funds obligated for public service activities cannot exceed 15% of the grant allocation. Grantees use CDBG funds for a wide range of public service activities, which include job training, daycare assistance for low-income working families, food banks, youth services, service for seniors, and other vital services. We urge Congress to eliminate the current 15% public service cap requirement and allow CDBG grantees to determine their public services cap as part of the consolidated plan process. As precedent, the CARES Act waived the public service cap to allow grantees utmost flexibility to respond to COVID-19. Provide more flexibility for grantees to use CDBG funds for new construction. America is facing an affordable housing crisis. Stable, decent, and affordable housing is critical to improving communities and economies. Local governments and their partners need resources to expand and preserve the supply of affordable housing. CDBG can be used for new construction of housing, but only in extremely limited circumstances. This narrow restricted use impedes communities from using CDBG to increase the supply of affordable housing. Local governments need to be able to use all the available tools to address the affordable housing crisis. And the use of CDBG for new construction is one tool that most communities have available. We urge Congress to broaden the CDBG statute to allow new construction of housing as an eligible program activity without restrictions. Provide more flexibility to fund for fair housing activities. And then the next one is to support nonprofit matters through TA and capacity building. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mensah, for your oral presentation. Ms. Robinson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Kimberly Robinson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, the regional planning agency for 43 communities here in Western Massachusetts. I am testifying today on behalf of the National Association of Regional Councils, or NARC, which serves as the national voice for regions by advocating for regional cooperation as the most effective way to address a variety of community planning and development opportunities and issues. NARC members include regional councils, councils of government, regional planning and development agencies, metropolitan planning organizations, and other regional organizations. Members work collaboratively with their communities, large and small, urban and rural, to address their citizens' needs and promote a regional approach to planning for the future. NARC has been a strong advocate for community development block grants since its inception, as it has a proven track record of assisting low-income neighborhoods in communities of all sizes across the country. It is a critical tool in our members' efforts to address poverty, inequity, economic development, and infrastructure needs. Its unique flexibility allows us to direct federal resources to frequently changing areas that are most in need each year. While most CDBG entitlement communities have populations of over 50,000, the program's reach goes far beyond that threshold. As you know, each state also receives CDBG allocation to be used in non-entitlement communities. My state of Massachusetts received over $35 million for that purpose in fiscal year 2021 alone. In this regard, CDBG cannot be viewed simply as a big city program. Of the 43 communities that are members of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, only 4 are CDBG entitlement communities. But PVPC provides technical assistance to many of our communities when they seek CDBG funds for various projects. PVPC both applies for funding and also administers the grants on behalf of these communities. In fiscal year 2019, PVPC worked with over 19 different communities on CDBG funded work, with populations ranging from 500 residents to 40,000 residents. We have aided over 30 municipalities since 1988. In order to encourage regional cooperation, the state increases the minimum allocation that a non-entitlement community can receive if they join with one or two other communities for regional efforts. The regional approach here in the Pioneer Valley has led to the long-term sustainability for services in many of our towns. A perfect example of this is the Southern Hill Towns regional applications, which have been funded since the mid-1980s. Some of the services here include infrastructure projects, a food pantry, senior programming, and a domestic violence prevention program. As another example, we have assisted the town of Agawam, a non-entitlement community, in applying for and administering CDBG funding for a variety of uses in the community. This includes improvements and repairs at an assisted housing site, a disabled accessibility study for town hall, an infrastructure of one of the town's most densely populated neighborhoods, and grants to small businesses with CARES Act funds. CDBG is a valuable program that works locally to address substandard housing, poor or non-existent infrastructure, pockets of decline, and neighborhood development. It provides the resources and tools that enable local communities to design flexible strategies to address these issues. CDBG is also an important leveraging tool for local communities to gain access to other funding sources. Every dollar of CDBG invested in communities leverages another $4.09 in private and public investment. CDBG is an impactful program, creating strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all. The program is a model in efficiency and effectiveness, using strategic planning and coordination to assist millions of low and moderate income people annually. Despite the impact and success brought by CDBG, there are not enough resources in the program to address all the needs of our communities and regions. While overall funding for the program has stabilized in the past few years, its funding level in 2021 is still almost $1 billion less than it was in 2004. As you may know, if the program's original allocation of $2.4 billion in 1975, was adjusted for inflation, the CDBG program would be receiving over $10 billion today. While I know this committee is not responsible for annual appropriations, we believe that restoring and increasing CDBG from that high water mark should be a priority for Congress. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have about the role that regions play in administering CDBG in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Robinson. Mr. Jurasik, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Mr. Jurasik, you may not be connected with us. If you will unmute, please. Mr. Jurasik? Sir, we're unable to hear you. We can see you, but we can't hear you. If you would please unmute. Staff, there may be some technical problem with Mr. Jurasik, and I don't want to miss his opening statement. The staff is trying to provide some assistance. Hey, this is the new world in which we're functioning.
Can we go to the next witness and come back to him?
All right, this is being worked on, so we will go on to Mr. Firth, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation.
Good morning, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you. My name is Salim Firth, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. My remarks today cover the need to reform the CDBG funding formula, 2 questionable categories of CDBG spending, and the inequitable treatment of non-entitlement. Congress intended CDBG for the benefit of low and moderate income people and the neighborhoods where they live. But the most impactful parts of the statute are the formulas, and the formulas fail to fulfill the stated purpose. These formulas took on added significance in the past year because the CARES Act and ARPA both used them to distribute a lot of money. As you know, there are 2 formulas for entitlement communities and 2 for states. The formulas reflect 1970s concern. This was the era of Ford to City drop dead and will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights? At the time, age and decline seemed synonymous. Thus, 70% of entitlement formula B depends on having old housing and a slow rate of growth. But today, New York City, Seattle, and many other cities have strong tax bases and booming economies. The inequities are even more egregious in the case of affluent pre-war suburbs. In Newton, Massachusetts, half of homes were built before 1940. The median household income is $150,000, but Newton receives $386 in CDBG per resident in poverty. McAllen, Texas, is much newer and less affluent. It receives half as much CDBG funding per capita and only $54 per resident in poverty. There's also an arbitrary distinction between entitlement and non-entitlement communities. As a result, inequities arise even between similar areas. Chelsea and Everett, Massachusetts, are working class suburbs with even older housing than Newton, but their populations are less than 50,000, so they receive funding through the state. They receive between $100 and $150 per person in poverty, better than McAllen, but still less than half of what Newton gets. Newton, in turn, can envy the towns of Martha's Vineyard, where summer is a verb, which somehow receives $1,700 per resident in poverty. The relationship between the CDBG program's stated goals and its true priorities, as reflected in its budget, is tenuous. In my written testimony, I suggest one way to transition gradually to better formulas. Moving on, there are a couple of legal uses of CDBG funding that are contrary to the spirit of the law. Number 1, subsidizing private businesses. Studies of so-called economic development subsidies find that they are ineffective at creating jobs. Instead, they boost recipient companies at the expense of everyone else. In my own research, looking at 17 states, I find that 4 states dedicate at least a quarter of their state CDBG funding to private subsidies. One town in Maine used 79% of its CDBG funding over 2 decades in support of a single local business. Targeted subsidies are an invitation to favoritism and petty corruption and are outside the scope of what governments ought to do. Another questionable use is when affluent communities use CDBG to eliminate cheap housing. Nobody calls it that, of course, but it is common to see exclusive locales spend their CDBG on the rehabilitation of single-family homes. The recipients all have low incomes, of course, but they implicitly have substantial wealth by dint of owning a home there. The well-funded Martha's Vineyard program I mentioned earlier has long used this tactic. It's completely innocent at the town level, for example, fixing up an old house, which was frankly an eyesore, so someone doesn't have to move. But the practice has the effect of raising the prices of what would have been the cheapest homes in town. To curb this, I recommend barring rehabs of units worth more than the national average. In many states, non-entitlement communities cannot set their own CDBG priorities. States allocate annual grants among various categories and entertain grant requests only within those categories. Entitlement communities, by contrast, have predictable funding and tremendous flexibility. There are good arguments to be made for either system, but using the 2 systems in parallel seems unfair. At a minimum, states should make their grants predictable so that small communities can approach the CDBG program as a budget rather than a lottery. In conclusion, I doubt that anyone on this call if they had a free hand budgeting 3.5 billion from scratch, would come up with CDBG. But this is a program Congress has inherited. It's not going away. And Congress should make the adjustments necessary to ensure that CDBG funds are distributed and spent equitably and in accordance with the program's intent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Firth. We want to try to go back to check to see if Mr. Jurasik has been able to connect with us. Mr. Jurasik, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Jurasik, if you would please call one of our.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, praise.
I'm sorry, I think something got mixed up, but I think it works now.
All right, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Joe Jurasik. I am an analyst in economic development policy with the Congressional Research Service. This CRS statement provides an overview of the Community Development Block Grant Program administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. In particular, it will focus on describing the program's structure, funding mechanisms, and potential policy considerations. CRS's role is to provide objective, nonpartisan research and analysis to Congress. Any arguments presented in my written and oral testimony are for the purposes of informing Congress and not to advocate for a particular policy outcome. The CDBG program is a primary source of flexible federal funding to states, localities, and insular areas for economic and community development and other related purposes. The program was originally authorized under Title I of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, with the primary purpose of establishing and maintaining viable urban communities through the implementation of activities that benefit low and moderate income persons. CDBG's flexibility as a block grant program allows grantees to use their program funds for a range of activities, from public services to infrastructure, among others. There are limits on certain types of activities, and any eligible activity must meet one of the program's 3 statutory national objectives: principally benefit low and moderate income persons, aid in the prevention or elimination of slums or blight, or meet an urgent need by addressing conditions that pose a serious and immediate threat to the health and safety of residents. The CDBG program is funded via discretionary appropriations to the Community Development Fund account. 70% of CDBG formula funds are distributed to entitlement communities defined as principal cities of metropolitan statistical areas, other metropolitan cities with populations of 50,000 or greater, and urban counties with populations of 200,000 or greater, when excluding entitlement city populations within county borders. 30% of formula funds are allocated to states based on a separate formula allocation process. States and Puerto Rico distribute these funds to communities that do not qualify for entitlement funds. States have broad discretion over the methods for distribution of these funds within their jurisdiction. Before formula allocations are made to states and localities, $7 million is statutorily set aside to be distributed among other U.S. territories or insular areas. The formula methodology developed by HUD based on direction in the CDBG statute includes several factors related to population or population growth, poverty, and housing characteristics. HUD program expenditure data indicate that public improvement activities and housing-related activities represent the majority of overall CDBG expenditures in general. Since the program's inception in 1975, the number of annual CDBG grant allocations has increased. During that same period, the annual CDBG funding amounts have declined based on inflation-adjusted dollars and other metrics. The CDBG program's authorizing legislation expired in 1994. Given changes in the national economy and policy priorities for states and local governments, there may be interest in revisiting aspects of the program. This concludes my prepared remarks. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to responding to any questions that you may have, and if additional research and analysis would be helpful, my CRS colleagues and I are prepared to assist the subcommittee. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, very much for your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses to please keep your cameras turned on during the full duration of our hearing, even when you're not speaking. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. One of the problems we have with CDBG is that most people, even communities that are receiving those dollars, have absolutely no idea the source of the dollars. I mean, they are, for example, in the belief that the money is coming from the state. In the state of Missouri, my home state, if you look at the Missouri Housing Development Corporation's statement, you can read through it, and there's not one single sentence about the origin of the dollars. So it's easy for people to come to the conclusion that the federal government is not participating in rural areas of our states, when the fact is that they're getting federal dollars, and I can tell you right now, experientially, they will not have any idea the source of those dollars. And I would agree with the ranking member. I think this is time for some adjustments from a program that started back in 1974. Actually, we benefited by the program that the CDBG program, which Richard Nixon was actually flirting with. Gerald Ford was able to get it through. But we haven't had any major changes. There have been no adjustments in the program, significant adjustments since it started. And given the importance of the community development block grant program, we've got to raise the awareness about the program in order to build support from it. There are individuals, probably hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who have received the benefits of this program and have absolutely no idea the origin of those dollars. So I just would like to find out from our witnesses, particularly Ms. Robinson, do you have any reason to doubt what I've just said about people, not knowing where the funds came from, and if you have any ideas on what can be done to make sure that people do have some idea about the origin of CDBG assistance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do believe that you have a good point. I think there's a lot of, at times, it can be confusing exactly where funding comes from. I think there are a couple things that really help, though. Community development block grant funds, even if they're running through the state, they're still being referred to as CDBG funds. And so to me, that is some shorthand for this money's coming from the federal government. I think the second thing that we can do, and certainly as an agency that applies for these funds and manages them across our communities, we could certainly make more of an effort to ensure that the residents understand that this is federal funding that is coming directly into their communities. And I took a note of that while you were speaking, so that we can start to do that in our communities. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any of the other witnesses would like to comment on that? Well, let me just add that one of the problems is when the funds come from the federal government and the entitlement cities receive their funding, the other community, the states, will receive their funding, and in all likelihood, they will put it into some kind of existing program: state economic development, state housing corporation, or any number of other government agencies, so that it gets washed out. The fact that these are community development block grant dollars that came from the federal government are washed out because now they're coming from a state agency. And I can assure you that the average person in a little small town receiving $10,000 from North Dakota state government has no idea that originated right here in Washington, D.C. And so we're going to always have a problem unless we can fix this big issue of the origin of the dollars and how we can make sure that people who are getting those dollars understand the origin so that they can have some appreciation for the program. In spite of that, we still need to make some changes. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again for having this really good, thoughtful oversight hearing, and our panel was very, very helpful. I was reading the Biden administration wants to change the definition of metropolitan statistical area from 50,000 to 100,000. That knocks out a lot of rural states, metro areas by increasing that. Let me ask the witness from Congressional Research Service, what kind of impact would that have on this, sir?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Yes, so the majority of existing CDBG grantees would remain in the program. Under the CDBG statute, there is essentially a grandfathering provision that eligible grantees that have been eligible for CDBG entitlement funds for 2 or more years are able to remain in the program, even if there are changes to the definitions for metropolitan statistical areas, or if their populations decrease below the threshold. What it would affect is the potential for communities that are near that 50,000 threshold, their potential eligibility in the near term.
Yeah, that hurts it prospectively for those growing communities. And then you say that if they've participated 2 or more years, they're essentially grandfathered. Does that really make it hard to modify these formulas if if you're in the program, we're like, you can't get out of the program?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Yes, so the grantees are able to opt out of the program if they wish, but what it has done is, as many of the witnesses have mentioned, the number of entitlement communities has increased over time, and part of that is because the grandfathering provision has stabilized existing CDBG grantees, the number of existing CDBG grantees, and then as additional communities have continued to grow, HUD has estimated in some reporting that the entitlement community program grows by 5 to 10 eligible grantees per year.
Thank you for that background. Mr. Firth, I really appreciated your testimony about the weighting in the formula, that it hasn't been reviewed. It's essentially based on urban life as we knew it in 1974. So that's 50 years ago, not reflecting true poverty needs in many, many communities. So I really appreciated your testimony. Turn to the subject of the 26 eligible uses for CDBG. Do you believe these should be limited or reevaluated? It really is, and I'm sure it's been added to over the years, probably never subtracted from. Give me your thoughts on those 26 approved uses.
Thank you, Ranking Member. As I said in the testimony, I think that subsidizing private businesses, that goes through a few of the different categories, but I think that's something that we should be able to agree is not the role of government generally, and is a significantly inferior use. The other witnesses here who talked about the great successes of CDBG in their communities did not talk about subsidizing businesses, and that's because it's usually not a great use. So I would get rid of, any kind of subsidies through any of those 26 items. Then the second thing that I would do is put some conditions on. So when you've got very affluent communities or communities with extremely strong tax bases that should be able to fund the basics of community life themselves without help, and where the big problem is that they're excluding people through their zoning, through the limits on who can move there, there should be more limits on how those types of communities can use funding, so that we actually have a program that is furthering fair housing in a very broad sense, right? Rather than subsidizing those who are comfortable and want to keep other people out of their communities.
Well, I really appreciated the panel's testimony. Lots of good different perspectives. Thank you, Mr. Cleaver, and I yield back.
Thank you. I would now recognize the chair of the full Financial Services Committee, the chair from California, Ms. Waters.
Today, I'd like to understand what I think is a mandate in CDBG, that you have hearings or community meetings to get input and to discuss, plans for funding. And I want to know if that's divided up by, for example, City of Los Angeles or the City of San Francisco by council districts, or is this hearings that are held in combination with all of the districts, or is this money basically divided up in terms of your council districts and everybody gets so much in order to deal with the problems in their district? Mayor Breed, could you help me with that?
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, and it's so great to see you here today. I'll tell you, in San Francisco, we have city councils that are basically the Board of Supervisors, and we don't necessarily divide it up on districts. We look at the income inequalities in specific zip codes, and we focus on the areas where we know the need is greater. But we also have, as you know, in 94115, we have an extremely wealthy community where area median income is over $100,000. And we have people living in extreme poverty where the annual median income is $8,000. So we have to be very creative and strategic, not just focusing on supervisorial districts, but really focusing on specific communities and how these dollars impact those communities directly. And we have various non-profit organizations. We do various meetings all over San Francisco to get feedback, but we also have a clear understanding of where the need is, and we provide it throughout San Francisco because poverty kind of exists in various pockets, although concentrated in certain neighborhoods.
All right, then are you telling me that you have the flexibility looking at the high-end neighborhoods, perhaps not to put as much money into those neighborhoods as you would in neighborhoods that are very poor, that really need more help? Do you have that flexibility?
Definitely have that flexibility, but the challenge sometimes is based on the reporting requirements, we run into some difficulties because, as I said, 94115 is a perfect example when talking about when submitting the compliance information to the federal government. They look at sometimes the average area median income of a particular zip code. So we have to break it up. We have to explain it so that we are able to leverage the funds necessary to support a community or a project. And sometimes it can get quite complicated, but we do have a level of flexibility there.
And so included in your allocation, you take care of the non-entitlement areas in the San Francisco area. How does that work? I heard how they do it with the regional look at this, but what is your responsibility, if any, dealing with the non-entitlement jurisdictions?
So San Francisco, the way it works is we're a city and a county, so we don't, have other cities within our county. We're just responsible for San Francisco, which provides us more of the flexibility to control how these dollars are spent directly. So we don't necessarily run into those problems in the same way as other jurisdictions.
I see. And lastly, you know, there's a lot of talk about urban versus rural all the time in so many different ways. I'm one who believes that urban and rural should be taken care of and should be funded adequately. What do you think about if we're talking about expanding the amount of money in this program, that we pay attention not only to our urban areas, but to the rural areas also?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the fact is, when we talk about equity, equity means different things to different communities. In a rural community, it's going to be different. It doesn't mean that there isn't poverty. It's just a different layer of poverty versus a very dense city like San Francisco. So having the level of flexibility for these resources and providing distribution of these resources in all communities to meet their needs and giving them the flexibility to use these dollars for the most important needs in their communities based on their experiences is how and why this program is important. And so I hope that it will continue, but also be expanded and look at addressing inequality throughout our entire country. And rural communities are a part of that for sure.
Well, thank you very much. You're the first mayor that I've heard talk about assisting tenants in the way that you're doing. Do you have any recommendations that you could get to Mr. Cleaver that would help us in whatever Mr. Cleaver provides the leadership to do to deal with the inequities and reform that's needed in CDBG? Would you help us with your recommendations?
Oh, definitely. I'd be happy to help you with the recommendations because at the end of the day, preventing people from being homeless is important. And so providing them with not only legal counsel, but also rental assistance is what has helped to keep people housed because they can end up, of course, on the streets or away from their families or communities. When you look at a place like San Francisco, which had a population of over 12% African Americans to the point where we're at less than 6% now, it has had everything to do with displacement and not making the right investments to not only build more housing, but to keep people housed and to keep them in their communities. The neighborhood I grew up with used to be a thriving African American community. And now you look at the income inequality and the disparities and how expensive it is to live in this community, it has changed significantly. So supporting tenants in this way is critical to the success of keeping people in their communities and keeping our cities diverse.
Thank you, Madam.
Thank you so much. And I want you to know with our CARES program and our relief program, the American Relief Program, we put $47 billion in it for tenants. And I don't know how it's been used. We'll talk about that later. My time has expired. Thank you so very much, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Posey, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver. Dr. Firth, the title of this hearing emphasizes the flexible funding of the local communities under the Community Development Block Grant Program. While flexibility is a great benefit to local governments, isn't it hard to assess the need for more or less government resources for Community Development Block Grant funding without some sort of national performance metrics?
Thank you, Congressman. That's absolutely right. CDBG replaced a bunch of specific federal grants for specific urban needs, right, like sewers and roads. And, so I think it's hard to go back and forth between those things. On the one hand, Congress reasonably wants accountability and wants to know that funds are being used in high quality ways. And on the other hand, neither Congress nor mayors want micromanagement from Washington. And so I think, you have the difficult task of trying to find a balance between those. My suggestion is to look at those approved uses and keep the flexibility, but narrow the scope and say, we have some things that either just generally across the board, like subsidizing private businesses, shouldn't be done. And then we have some things that conditionally shouldn't be done, right? So if your community reaches certain metrics where having private houses is probably raising housing costs, not making more units habitable that were uninhabitable, then you shouldn't be doing that. And so there should be some more oversight in terms of the scope. But I don't think I would want to go back to the old method of, Washington giving a city money that can only be used on sewers that doesn't need sewer replacement, right? So it's a tough question, and I don't envy you your job in that respect.
Well, that's a good answer. Do you believe we can develop national performance metrics for the CDBG program that will allow us to evaluate the need for more or less funding? Or is this program focusing on local discretion simply a matter of what we can afford to spare at the national level?
I think that could be realistic to do with the state CDBG programs, but partly because there's only 50 states, and they are looking at a broad enough cross-section of communities that you can sort of look at what they're doing with the money over time. And, like I said, some states are putting money into things that I think are pretty questionable given their circumstances. I don't think that you could kind of compare apples to apples across, say, we've heard about Agawam, Massachusetts, and San Francisco, California, right? The needs and circumstances are so different that even starting to compare the needs and the uses is really difficult. Obviously, it's important that HUD continue its work of, making sure that funds are being spent responsibly, right? That there isn't insider dealing. Wherever there's funding, there's an opportunity for corruption. And, that's just the kind of the grunt work of running a grant program, is making sure that your grantees are doing what they say they're doing. But that's HUD's job, not Congress's, unless HUD's really laying down on it. And I don't think there's any evidence of that. But yeah, I would focus really on the formula and making sure that communities are getting a reasonably equitable allocation of the money, because right now that's not happening.
The number of entitlements or entitlement communities under the CDBG has increased from 594 to 1,236 over the life of the program. What does your research on the program suggest about the performance of the program since its inception?
So CDBG has been, very popular with the recipients and a lot less popular with Congress. And I think that makes sense, right? So the recipients get a ton of flexibility. Those who are favored by the existing formulas love it. And the growing number of entitlement communities, that reflects a growing national population. That's not surprising. But the flexibility and the sort of the privileging of certain communities over others means that the people who represent those privileged communities are going to yell very loud if they are, disfavored, if they lose any funding relative to communities that Congress decides have more need. And I think as Congress has come back to, poverty, community needs over the decades, it looks at CDBG and it says, actually, this does not target the problem that I want to solve. If you want to target, say lead abatement or child poverty, CDBG isn't targeting that. So that's why Congress has chosen to fund other things instead.
Thank you. I see my time has expired, and I yield back to Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. The chair now recognizes Ms. Joyce Beatty of Ohio, and let me just say, Ms. Beatty, on behalf of the subcommittee and of course our chairperson, Ms. Waters, was there at the funeral service of your husband Otto. That all of us are still wishing you the very best as you move through this period of loss. In my world, it's not a loss, but you just simply don't see the loved one anymore. But we are still supporting you. I recognize you now for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to Chairwoman Waters, thank you, and to all of our witnesses. Today is a difficult day for me, and I really appreciate your condolences, but it's also a good day. My husband, Otto, was a longtime developer and fought hard for increasing housing for low income and extremely low income. And to the witnesses, I have a long history of being a HUD consultant, doing a lot of work in the public housing space, doing relocation work, and have been a longtime fan of community development block grant work. So much so, no offense to the mayors and those from city and state, that you like the funding and the work so much that oftentimes you take a lot of credit for it, and we don't see the behind scenes work that people like Chairman Cleaver and Chairwoman Waters advocate for, that funding that really comes from our legislative work and our fight for community development block grants. So Mr. Jarczyk and others, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to state the question and give you the reason why. Roughly what percentage of community development block grant funding is used for affordable housing construction? And the reason I ask this question is, according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition in my district, Ohio only has 32 affordable housing units available per 100 extremely low income households, which roughly means that 32% of those extremely low income households can find affordable housing in my district. And so that's why I led a delegation appropriation letter with 70 of my colleagues requesting $1.85 billion for Home Investment Partnership Program. And I drafted, thanks to our chairwoman in supporting it, the GROW, the Affordable Housing Act, to provide more funding to build more affordable housing. So with that, can you answer that question? And then Mr. Mensah and Ms. Breed and Robinson.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So housing-related activities broadly represent about 26% of the funds expended year to year through the state entitlement and the insular areas programs. In terms of specific construction of new affordable housing, I'm not sure of the percentage, but I can definitely follow up.
Okay, thank you.
I would say there are some restrictions, and only eligible community-based development organizations can implement those new construction-related activities.
Okay, Ms. Breed. Mr. Mensah. Okay, I'm on the clock, so I'm just rushing a little bit.
Congresswoman, as you can see, we weren't able to answer that question because of the fact that the CDBG program doesn't really allow you to build new construction because of the enormous limitations. And that's the reason why we've suggested that the program be changed to allow new construction without any limitations whatsoever. And I think if we do that, then entities that doesn't even receive home funds can still use their CDBG for affordable housing construction.
Thank you. That gives us something certainly that we can work on legislatively or taking a look at that. Because, you know, I have an issue when you talk about low and extremely low income individuals, we always appear to make that problematic and their fault, and they have to live within the confines of what we have versus as we live. You know, we move upwards and buy newer or more step up in our housing. And I think we should be working to help those who live in poverty have access to the same opportunities in housing as us. Ms. Robinson, any comments?
Yes, thank you very much, Representative Beatty. Really quickly, I would like to support what Mr. Mensah described in terms of the need to support affordable housing construction with CDBG. I would like to point out that we consistently do housing rehabilitation here in Western Massachusetts. We kept 115 families in their homes last year, and these are not residences that are then being turned over onto the private market. This is actually homes that are being lived in. Thank you.
Thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Huizenga from Michigan. You now have 5 minutes, Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, you may be muted. Mr. Huizenga, you may, if you're having some technical problems, we may have to, we may proceed and come back to you shortly. We will do so. We'll go to Mr. Hollingsworth from Indiana, and we'll come back to you, Mr. Huizenga, as we try to work out whatever the technical problem is. Mr. Hollingsworth, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Hollingsworth of Indiana, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Well, I don't know if that represents a couple of technical issues we're having, but I'm sure the staff is already trying to address those issues. We apologize. This won't be the last time something like this happens until we are able to recover from the COVID issues and have just in-person meetings. But right now, we're still going to have virtual meetings. So we will move on, continue on, and come back to Mr. Huizenga and Mr. Hollingsworth after the technical difficulties have been worked out. And if there is if there's a chance that we won't get you worked out until the end of the program, we'll still continue. So we'll now recognize Mr. Taylor of Texas. You're now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Chairman. I really appreciate the opportunity to be this hearing. I think this is really important as we think about how taxpayer dollars are used. Mayor, wanted to just query you on your leadership of San Francisco, clearly a very important city in America. I've had many friends, classmates, family members call San Francisco home, a really important city and community for the future of our country. And I just in kind of reviewing for this hearing, I was really surprised to see that, I think this is right, your city is spending approximately $15,000 per person in city budget, whereas my own community of Plano, Texas is spending about $1,000. Is the 15,000 numbers per person, does that sound about right, Mayor?
And what are you referring to as it relates to the $15,000 per person for home?
Your per capita budget.
Well, just to be clear, San Francisco is not a city and a county, and right. Have a population of close to 900,000 people, but we're part of a major Bay Area city, and we manage a number of significant dollars for both a airport, public utilities commission, the port. These are enterprise departments, and there are restrictions within their budget, so it's not necessarily fair to imply a per person spending.
Okay. But is it fair? Well, I guess anyway. It seems to me you're spending a lot of money. You might say you're not, but just looking at a quick blush at the numbers would indicate that. And I wanted to share a perspective that you probably don't hear very often, because I speak to people that leave your city and come to mine. Collin County, Texas, is a recipient of many people who describe themselves as blue state refugees. People who say that they're fleeing high taxes, they're fleeing regulations, they're concerned about crime, they're concerned about drug overdoses, they're concerned about communities that they feel no longer serve them, and they come to my community. And what my concern is, as an American, is I don't see how we have a winning America if we have a losing California, particularly if we have a losing San Francisco. San Francisco is an important community, and I appreciate your willingness to lead it in these troubling times. And the one other thing I'll throw in here, and I don't think this is your responsibility, is traffic. That actually comes up very frequently as businesses come from your portion of the country to my portion of the country. And just to quantify this, I was looking at U-Haul, their website last night. And so if I wanted to rent a U-Haul trailer and drive from Plano, Texas to San Francisco, it'd be $1,300. To get that exact same U-Haul for the same period of time would be $3,300 to go from San Francisco to Plano. So very clearly, the market is speaking to the influx of people leaving your community and coming to mine. And my question to you is, and I also know you're receiving a tremendous number of CBD grants. I think you're top 10 city in the United States in terms of the receipt of CBD grants. Like, what were you gonna use that money to do to try to turn the tide and go in a different direction than you're going now?
Well, just so you know, I want to make it clear, San Francisco is not a losing city. In fact, San Francisco produced me. I grew up in poverty in San Francisco. I lived in public housing, in fact, over 20 years of my life raised by my grandmother. These kinds of investments can have an impact on changing people's lives. And the fact is, our budget and the way that our city works as a county is a lot more complicated than what the budget implies, as I said. I mean, an airport and the expense of
Again, my question was like, I mean, and actually, just as I was looking at your written testimony, you talked about 5 priorities that you had, and what I was intrigued by is none of the priorities you listed are the reasons that people tell me they're leaving your community, right? So if people leave your community, they come to mine, and look, and I look good for it, right? I'm adding jobs. Plano, Texas is a very safe city. It's actually in 2019 was the safest city in America. We're the highest per capita income city in North America with over 250,000 people. Very successful community. And unfortunately, a lot of those people are people like you who are leaving. They're leaving California and they're coming to Plano. They're coming to Frisco. They're coming to Allen. They're coming to McKinney. They're coming to my community to build a better life for themselves. And they tell me about all the problems they find. What's interesting to me is of the 5 things that you list in your written testimony, I didn't see anything about traffic, about drug abuse, about regulations, about taxes. I mean, these are the reasons that people tell me they're leaving your community to come to mine. What are you doing to address those issues?
Congressman, just to be clear, there was a point where we had a significant tech boom. And what happened during that time, a lot of people were pushed out. And I think the fact that you are attributing the fact that folks are coming to your community and leaving San Francisco, you perceive that as a problem. I don't necessarily perceive that as a problem because our economy is still thriving. We're still making the appropriate investments to address the inequities and the challenges. So, I mean, I know there isn't enough time to expand on that, but, at the end of the day, it's not as much of a problem as you believe that it is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, I've look forward to working with this committee. We got some very, very similar views on some of the things that need to be done with CDBG. So I appreciate it very much. I want to do it with that, with the minimum amount of partisanship. But I kind of feel like I've got to correct the record. Mr. Hill had stated that the Biden administration submitted a change to the Office of OMB to alter the threshold definition of metropolitan statistical areas from including MSAs with populations at least 50,000 to 100,000. And this was, in fact, a change submitted by the Trump administration just before leaving office back in January. I'd like to submit to the record the OMB notice to the Trump administration proposed changes. So if without objection, I would like to submit that. The chair now recognizes Mr. Huizinga. You're recognized for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, Mr. Al Green, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I greatly appreciate the hearing as well, and do want to associate myself with the ranking member with reference to his comments about flexibility. And I'd like to direct my question to you, Mr. Jarosik, at an appropriate time, but let me lay a proper predicate for the question. In Houston, back in August of 2017, we had 1 trillion gallons of water to flow in about 4-day period, 68 deaths, 125 billion in damages. This was Hurricane Harvey. Nearly 4 years later, the funds that were sent to Houston to assist with our recovery, some $4.3 billion, not all of this has been properly allocated. In fact, the money came to Houston by way of the Government Land Office, the GLO. The GLO, in making decisions about proper allocation, concluded initially that Houston should get $0. $0 for CDBG MIT funds. These are mitigation funds. It is not unusual for us to use CDBG for something other than DR, disaster relief. Mitigation is one aspect of it, and we also use it for COVID as well. but $0 for Houston. Of course, this is unacceptable. And currently, the GLO has a responsibility, a duty, and an obligation to amend its action plan with HUD. And until the action plan is amended, no one gets any money. For whatever reasons, inexplicable reasons, I might add, GLO has not amended the action plan. My concern is this: do we need some sort of means by which we can reclaim those funds? The funds can be forfeited, requirement that they be returned. This can go on indefinitely, and the people of Houston are suffering. So my question, Mr. Jarosik, is do you foresee a means by which this can be done? And is this an unacceptable way for us to do business, to allow funds to just be allocated and depend upon the whims of the recipient as to when they will be properly allocated to the end users?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. I would want to look into this in a little more detail and follow up, because each CDBG DR supplemental appropriation, as you are aware, may be slightly different and have different provisions in it that provide different processes and methods. And then HUD also develops individual rulemaking for each supplemental appropriation of DR funds and MIT funds. So my colleagues and I would be happy to do some more analysis on this issue.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. Permit me to ask you this. We agree that each supplemental is done on a case-by-case basis. So this is why we have a CDBG DR bill legislation that will be filed again, passed in the last Congress. Mr. Hill referenced it, and we'd like to pass it again. And it streamlines this process, and it does require action within a 6-year period. I believe that this is an appropriate way for us to manage the government dollars in a responsible way. Your thoughts on such a means of management?
Thank you, Congressman. I think proposals related to permanent authorization of CDBG DR would potentially provide, some structure and potential ability for HUD and Congress to provide a predictable oversight of the program and monitor performance. It would also potentially, there may be some trade-offs regarding flexibility and the ability to provide funding based on the individual event and the context therein. So those are some of the different things that we've observed in analyzing.
Well, let me thank you, as my time is running out. And I also would like to thank Ms. Wagner. She has been a co-sponsor of this legislation, and I have also been a co-sponsor with her. So thank you, Ms. Wagner, for staying with us.
Thank you, Mr. Green. We will now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga, for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you, Chair Cleaver. I appreciate that. Mr. Firth, I want to kind of expand a little bit, or have you expand a little bit, the conversation that was happening with my colleague from Texas, Mr. Taylor, about sort of the use of CDBG funds and those kinds of things. I'm curious if you could comment on how local zoning laws interact with and affect choices regarding the use of CDBG funding. That has been a major focus that we have talked about here in this subcommittee and on the committee, is about housing affordability. How do we make sure that people have opportunity to live in good homes, reasonably priced? And this has been a sort of an emerging theme, has been sort of those local barriers. I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. And then how can we in Congress, if at all, do a better job of eliminating barriers like local development, exclusionary zones to help communities meet their housing and affordability challenges?
Well, thank you so much, Congressman. Zoning is my favorite topic, and
that's a pretty thin group of people in this world, but I'm glad you are, because it's so important.
No, that's right. So, I think the really positive thing right now about zoning reform is that it's being recognized on both sides of the aisle and all around the country. I know, Mayor Breed has been a champion in her own city of making it easier to build multifamily housing. I've worked with people from both parties in the Northeast on statewide bills and on local efforts. I think it's best when cities lead, and sometimes the states need to get involved. I'm more hesitant about federal involvement because ultimately the incentives and the realities of how the federal government works are probably not going to produce great outcomes at the local level. I know, Chairman Cleaver in this committee has a bill, part of which would be incentives similar to CDBG for communities that remove barriers. And I actually worked extensively with colleagues commenting on the AFFH rule. Whether that's the right vehicle for this is, I think, an open question. But we worked really, really hard to think about how could we compare cities across the country on a fair basis, right? Cities are in different positions at different points in their life cycle. And how can we compare them fairly in terms of their housing market outcomes? And so I think, Chairman Cleaver and others, as you look at, how to deal with federal involvement here, my number one recommendation is to look at outcomes rather than inputs. It's very easy to say that you've changed something, but if you actually look at outcomes, you get some very, very different results. Where it's easy to say it and hard to do.
I'm with you philosophically, and I too have a natural, healthy skepticism of the federal government coming in and bigfooting and frankly putting in a sort of a blanket policy that doesn't work in every community. I think we do understand that this formula needs to be updated. It has some failings and some challenges, and I'm curious what factors should be considered to ensure that the CDBG program is meeting its stated goals and eventually the outcomes.
So I would love to see CDBG under stricter scrutiny or limited in its amount for communities where rent rises above a certain level and construction does not, right? If you're expensive in your building, okay, try. And then, the formula should be revisited. I understand it's very hard to take away funding from anyone, but if Congress raises the allocation in nominal dollars, the new dollars should use a different formula. So nobody's losing funding, but the new funding is going to be distributed according to a formula that really reflects needs and isn't going to people who are lucky enough to have old housing at a low rate of growth because of zoning.
I think that's a very prescient and clear view into one of those issues that we have. So, and in the last remaining seconds, how do we then maybe ease that transition? You had suggested one thing. Is there anything else where we would have new criteria for new money, but can we not reform that current dollar?
I would put a sunset date on the old formula beyond the political lives of current leaders who can then accept that sometime in the future that money is not going to be allocated according to a 1970s formula. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. That was great.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Vargas of California. You're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, I thank you and the ranking member for putting on this very important hearing, and I thank the witnesses. But I do want to help you a little bit, Mr. Chairman. When you said praise, you couldn't remember the next term. Praise. It's praise Jesus. That's what it is. Praise Jesus. You never go wrong with that. Always go right with that. It's called praise Jesus. It's just like you can never go wrong by saying, just vote me with the chair. She always knows what's going on. Vote me with the chair. That being said, I do want to rehabilitate my state a little bit. My good friend, Mr. Taylor, was talking about California. I think, Mr. Taylor, I believe that the surplus in California, just the surplus alone, is bigger than the state budget of Texas, just our surplus. We have a $75 billion surplus this year in the state of California. I believe that the biannual budget of Texas is $121 billion. It's a biannual budget. But that being said, it may be incorrect, Mr. Taylor. What is the budget? I'll give you the opportunity to correct the number. What is the budget, Mr. Taylor, of the state of California, if you don't mind?
$250 billion biannual budget was passed this year.
I thought it was 121. Okay, I stand corrected.
121 would be last year's annual budget.
Okay, I stand corrected. But I'd also say this, which is interesting about home prices. Yes, in San Diego, where I live, the prices are very, very high because that's where people want to live. That's where people want to live. And that's the reality. I mean, the truth of the matter is we get a lot of people coming to California and they're high wage earners. And that's a problem because we don't have enough affordable housing. And that really is a problem. I seldom agree with my good friend, Mr. Huizenga, although I love him to death, but I seldom agree with him. But I agree with him on this. Zoning is a problem. Density is a problem. It really is. In California, when they say you're going to destroy the character of this community, it basically says, don't put anything that's attached product. We want single family detached homes. And that's a problem, especially when you're close to the city and close for transportation. We've been trying to change that. It's been very, very difficult. Mr. Huizenga, I totally agree with you on that we have to change density. But the reason, again, that California people are leaving, they can't afford the housing. Housing is just too expensive. People want to live in California. They just can't afford it. That's why they do second or third choice and move to Texas. I'm just kidding, Mr. Taylor. I love Texas, too. It's a wonderful state. Plano in particular is a wonderful city. But I do want to ask about this. You know, I looked at an inflation calculator. If we did, in fact, spend, I think it was $2.4 billion in 1974, the inflation calculators that I put the numbers into, I think would be that we would be spending over $13 billion today. I believe Kimberly Robinson, you said over 10 billion, but I think it's 13 billion that we would be spending today on CDBG if we just figured out inflation. So I think we're underspending. I do want to ask this though, and I'll ask this again to Mr. Furtei. You said that we cannot use money for new construction, but it is used for new construction. It's just some people can't use it for new construction. Some groups can't use it. And you say that private entities shouldn't be able to, but what about a 501c3? Would you be against that?
Oh, so yeah, let me clarify. When I'm talking about giving money to private entities, it's businesses for their own business purposes. So in Maine, where I did a lot of research, there's money going to the distillery, Sebago Distillery Limited. There's money going to the Gelato Fiasco, which is a gelato shop. So they aren't building something for the public. They're just doing their own business. So that's what I don't like. I have no problem. Mr. Mensah suggested expanding the ability to build housing through CDBG, and I'd have to look at the details, but in spirit, I certainly support that idea.
I agree with that. Now, Mayor Breed, I have to tell you, I love San Francisco. It's a beautiful city. And again, you have even the worst problem that we do. I mean, people love it so much that your prices have gone higher than San Diego, and that's problematic. But you did bring up something that I found very interesting, the issue of helping people legally stay in their homes, and that's been very effective because usually it's not the legal aspect, it's the paying aspect. You can't pay the rent or you can't pay the mortgage. So how were you able to be so successful just by helping legally?
I think when you think about it, especially people who live in poverty, and in San Francisco, over 300,000 people file for unemployment. Yes, we had a rent moratorium, but what about those mom and pop landlords who can't afford to wait to pay their mortgage because they're not receiving rent? It's very complicated. But what we've done is provided alternatives, and with the legal assistance, we also provide rental assistance. So if the dispute is maybe back rent for a couple of months, that's the difference. Just imagine paying that back rent versus someone who's homeless and then needing to invest a significant amount of money to get them housed again. It's a better investment.
Thank you. I agree. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Praise Jesus.
Amen. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hollingsworth from Indiana.
Well, good morning. I appreciate everybody being here. Dr. Firth, I'm going to talk mostly with you and talk about a YIMBY Act that you mentioned in an op-ed last year entitled, "Will Congress Make a Significant Move on Housing Affordability?" I really appreciated that you mentioned the Yes in My Backyard Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation that I recently introduced to encourage more affordable housing and bring some transparency to restrictive zoning laws. I know you and Mr. Huizinga recently talked about that in this very hearing. I think earlier today I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal where the Board of Realtors said nationally we're about 5.5 million housing units short of where we should be, given some underbuilding over the last 15 years or so. Wanted to ask you a few questions about that. One of the statements that you made in that op-ed, you said, and I'll quote, "Local leaders should see clearly that their national representatives are on the side of inclusive, market-led housing construction. Such an effort will require more two-way communication with federally funded cities, which use federal grants responsibly," in quotation. So, Dr. Firth, can you elaborate a little bit about what you mean by two-way communication and how those signals coming from cities are very important in forming public policy that goes back out to those cities?
Yes, thank you, Congressman Hollingsworth, and thank you especially for your work on the YIMBY Act. I think it's really important. As I wrote, it's not highly consequential, right? It's clearly a step in the direction of transparency and communication, and so I think that's what's valuable about that. And some of my colleagues who are pro-housing folks have said, this is why are they wasting their time? But I don't think you're wasting your time, and I do think that it's a very worthwhile effort to make it clear, right, that we just heard from Congressman Vargas, right? He represents people in a district that's strictly zoned, and there's a very active debate within the local politics of San Diego and the surrounding suburbs of whether they should upzone or not. And knowing that sort of the national leaders they look up to, right, maybe the job they want to hold in 20 years, those folks, you in Indiana, the other representatives who are here on the call, that you support more housing, that tilts the scales. It changes, it frames the debate. It helps define what does it mean to be, a pro-Indiana, pro-growth, pro-free marketer. I hear from conservative friends of mine sometimes, getting rid of zoning, that impinges on my property rights. I don't think those words mean what you think they mean. So on the two-way communication, that means, you talking to them and saying, hey, Carmel, Indiana, Indianapolis, I love what you're doing in this area. Or, hey, we would love to support, the federal government has these goals of achieving affordable housing, but right now, when I talk to developers, they can't find a site in this community. Yep. Talking to folks and making it clear where you stand. And then listening, right? So obviously, it's really important to listen to the mayors and local officials and try to help them assuage their concerns and communicate with their constituents. Congress people are in an enviable position because you don't actually have to make the hard calls on zoning. So in one sense, you can say some of the harder truths to constituents that a mayor or a council member might get a lot of blowback if they said the same things.
Exactly. I think, as you well said, Dr. Firth, the reality is we need to be leaders on this issue, help be conduits on this issue, help educate on this issue, especially citizens that live in particular areas. And I really appreciate that. It was disheartening to hear that it may not be entirely consequential, this legislation, but I do understand that it is incremental, but is important progress to showing both the direction that I think we want to head. I just want to make one last question here. Would you agree that this reporting framework works in tandem with private market-driven housing investment? I think you made that point already, but I really want to drive that home for all of my friends here to understand that this is a reporting framework not to drive federal government direction necessarily, but to work in tandem with good private market investment to expand supply.
Yeah, right. The great thing about housing is that people right down through the working class can get good quality housing provided by the private market, provided that the local government is not imposing zoning that is so strict that the private market can't build. Right.
Would
so
you
having
also
that transparency enables the private market to do its job and let the federal government focus on only those who are in the most need.
Right. And I presume you would also agree, given your background, that the reality of large-scale housing subsidies, given the inelastic supply in housing, would only lead to increased costs for consumers, not more affordability. Is that true or untrue, real quick?
Yeah, that's right. If you push on a rigid supply curve, you're just pushing up prices.
Perfect. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back, but I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter for the record in support of my YIMBY Act before I do so. Is that acceptable?
Without objection.
Thanks, sir. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We will now recognize Mr. Torres, the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a strong supporter of the CDBG program and the flexibility it provides to state and local governments, which are on the front lines of providing critical public services. The New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, most commonly known as HPD, uses CDBG funding to maintain the largest system of housing code enforcement in the nation. If a tenant in New York City has a condition that violates the housing maintenance code and the landlord refuses to correct the condition, a tenant reserves the right to call 311 to request a housing inspection, and a housing inspector often follows up within a matter of days. I got my start in politics as a housing organizer, and as a housing organizer, I found the CDBG funded housing code enforcement to be a powerful tool for holding landlords accountable for making long overdue repairs. In 2019 in New York City, the CDBG program funded 650,000 housing inspections, 15,000 housing litigation cases, and 11,000 emergency repairs, which are often a matter of life and death. Housing quality matters as much as housing affordability, and the CDBG program has been an indispensable safeguard of housing quality in America's largest city. When it comes to CDBG, the more flexibility, the merrier. I have a question about the CDBG program as it applies to disaster recovery. Do any of the witnesses have experience with both CDBG and FEMA funding with respect to disaster recovery? I'm curious to know which program is more user-friendly from the standpoint of state and local government.
This is George Mensah. Definitely the CDBG program is much more user-friendly than the CDBGR. I think one of the things that Congress can do is at least have a permanent or some type of regulation governing the CDBGR. Currently, when Congress provides funding through the CDBGR, it takes a long time for HUD to be able to do regulations governing. So the funds come to communities at a later stage and not when they really need it. So one of the things that Congress can do is to ensure that we have, just as we have statute for the CDBG program, that there's a separate statute for the CDBGR program, so that when the funds are allocated, HUD can easily provide the funds out the door. I think that probably will be very helpful.
And I have a question for the Congressional Research Service. Do we know what share of CDBG funding is allocated to states versus localities? Do we know the distribution?
Sure. So entitlement communities or localities with populations above 50,000 receive 70% of the CDBG funds, and states receive 30%. Both formula are run after a $7 million set aside for insular areas or U.S. territories.
And are those funds received directly or through the states?
The funds for entitlement communities, so cities, major metropolitan cities, cities with populations of 50,000 or more, or urban counties with populations of 200,000 or more, when subtracting any entitlement communities within the boundaries, those go directly to those communities, and then states receive the 30% allocation, and states sub-allocate those funds to non-entitlement communities.
And I'm curious to know, anyone on the panel can answer, what's the single most important reform that we can make to enhance the flexibility of the CDBG program?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear you clearly.
Just the single most important reform that we can make to enhance the flexibility of CDBG funding.
I just would add, thank you, Congressman, for the opportunity. I do think that what was mentioned is the need to increase the amount of funding that we received and to maintain a level of flexibility. I would definitely be open to increasing options of ways in which we can use these funds to invest in communities, but the need is very great, so increase in funding is most significant.
Does anyone else on the panel have thoughts on how to make the program more flexible?
Yes. Sorry. No, Representative, I wanted to add that you did describe the public services as we talked about the use of CDBG funds in New York City. So I think that increasing the cap for the public service is very important to help New York City in the work that they do using CDBG funds.
My time is about to expire, so thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rose from Tennessee.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver and Ranking Member Hill, for holding this important hearing. At home in Middle Tennessee, our rural communities heavily depend on the Community Development Block Grant Program, and they consider it vital to provide services that all Americans should have access to, including something as basic as running water. In the rural areas of my district, these grants are far more competitive to secure than they used to be. Only about 40% of applicants actually get funded, which means our rural communities continue to struggle to complete essential projects. I believe that we should consider setting aside funding in the CDBG program specifically for rural projects, because we cannot continue to leave Americans like those in my district behind. After talking to folks back in Tennessee who facilitate the CDBG program, the major regulatory hurdles in place are their biggest concern. They told me about how complying with wage rate and environmental requirements slows down the process considerably and makes it even harder to distribute the aid that they receive. They also discussed how many of the requirements in place are geared more towards private entities on the entitlement side as opposed to the state side, making them difficult to adhere to. Dr. Firth, could you discuss how we could eliminate some of this red tape and tailor these requirements to reduce undue burden on our states and rural communities?
Congressman Rose, thank you so much for the question. I appreciate it. So one of the things that you mentioned, right, is the federal prevailing wage standards. And if you look at the actual numbers that go into those, they're really low quality from a data perspective. If we simply used federal data that already exists from other occupational sources and had accurate prevailing wage rates, that would, in some cases, raise and in some cases lower the required prevailing wage, by region. In the cases where it's too low, it's just dumb. Nobody will work for that wage. In the cases where it's too high and it's just sort of bad data, it requires government to pay more than it should, more than the market rate, for doing reasonable work on public projects. So that's absolutely a step that the federal government could take. It's far beyond the scope of just CDBG, but it affects CDBG and everything else that's federally funded.
Thank you, Dr. Firth. By statute, CDBG funds are split with 70% going directly to the 1,200 or so nationwide urban entitlement communities with populations over 50,000, and only 30% to states, which must disperse that funding to every other small community in the state. That means that places with populations as large as 49,999, like Smith and Putnam counties in my district, are forced to compete for an already small share of CDBG funding with very small rural locations of less than 2,500, where almost 60 million people, or 19% of all Americans, live. Dr. Firth, should very small rural locations like those with populations of less than 2,500 have their own specific set aside of CDBG funds to help meet their local needs?
So thank you. I would set it up so that every place has predictable funding. Now, very small places might not get funding every year, because the allocations would be too small. But if you're a really small place, you should know, hey, every 3 years we get the minimum grant level. built, something like that, provided that we have a good way to use the money. I think that would be much more fair than the current system. And it's not strictly urban rural, right? So I mentioned Chelsea and Everett, Massachusetts in my testimony. Those are extremely urban, very dense immigrant towns, but they have less than 50,000 people. And then on the flip side, you go to say Auburn, Maine, which has 24,000 people, but its name shows up in an MSA name. And because its name is in an MSA name at OMB, it gets an entitlement fund. And the counties you mentioned, they'd actually have to get to 200,000 before they got to be entitlement communities. So it depends on how your governments are organized. Massachusetts and Tennessee organize governments, local governments, very differently. But the funding formulas don't take that into account and are not fair just on a per capita or a per low and moderate income capita basis, which is, I think, the way that I would want to do it.
Thank you, Dr. Firth. Something that folks back home emphasized to me was that right now our local communities are getting a massive influx of funding for infrastructure projects from COVID relief funds. However, once that windfall is over, we will still need the CDBG program in those areas to ensure we not only maintain that infrastructure, but continue to develop our rural communities. And thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stiles from Wisconsin.
Thank you very much, Chairman. We all look forward to being in person soon, but I know it's been a long time on Zoom for some of our witnesses, but let me dive in if I can, in particular, Dr. Firth, if I can ask you, I'm looking at how we really address housing in the United States and some of the policies, in particular, how these grants have a role in making sure that housing is affordable for folks in the United States. As we've seen, cities around the country receive millions in CDBG funds from the federal government each year. And at the same time, more and more of these cities are experiencing severe housing shortages and increasing costs. It's bad for families. It makes it harder to build wealth. And ultimately makes it difficult for people to become really rooted in their communities. When we look at the data, it seems many local governments in particular are making it difficult to build housing for more people and to keep housing prices in check. We're having a supply problem in some of our largest cities. And so I looked into the data. I looked at San Francisco, the metropolitan area, an area of about 5 million people, including San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley. In 2020, they permitted 10,000 new housing units. That's roughly in line with Boise, Idaho, which permitted 9,700. Metro Boston, an area of roughly 5 million, permitted just 15,000 units. And you compare that to Houston Metro, 7 million people, that permitted 70,000 new units, roughly 5, 6, 7 times more. And so one of the questions I had for you is, should Congress be looking at its use of CDBG funds as it relates to municipalities that are clearly failing to take steps to enact policy changes needed to really address the supply side of housing?
Yes, thank you, Representative. That's absolutely right. I mean, those numbers are shocking. I did some research at one point and found the California Bay Area, this was, I think, 2011 through 2018, had a growth rate in terms of the number of housing units built, the same as the Flint, Michigan metro area, which was in a major crisis at the time. So the coastal cities are building so little housing. And I live in one, right? I live in the DC area. People here act like, it's an apocalypse when, someone puts up a fourplex because they're so unaccustomed to seeing construction. And that's very, very different right in, Texas, in southern Wisconsin, in a lot of other places. In terms of CDBG, it's not the best tool to incentivize housing construction. We have to be really clear about that. I do think that it would make sense to have limits on the uses, especially for high-income, low-growth jurisdictions. If your rents are high and you're...
If I can, Mr. Firth, let me dive in, because I think you bring up a really good point here that I want to dive into a little bit with you, if I can. Because with CDBG grants, they were created 50 years ago to help low and income communities by giving them access to relatively flexible funds. And so we're talking about this not really driven on the housing. It's just one of the things I have concern with. We talk a lot about it on committee. I'm really concerned about the supply side and how some of our larger metro areas are restricting supply, driving prices up, and we see policy solutions being offered here in committee, often to provide additional funds for people, which I think would actually just bid up the prices further rather than addressing the supply side. But let's go back into the flexibilities offered, how these funds are originally intended to be used. And I look at the funds for 26 different broadly defined eligible purposes, ranging from construction of public facilities to assistance for private and for-profit entities. Does the CDBG, does this structure, does it really prioritize certain fundings over others? It doesn't, correct?
No.
And
No,
so
that's
do you
right.
think, so knowing that, so right, so saying it doesn't really prioritize it, housing is a concern of this committee. I think we're really missing the boat, in particular on our opportunity to add housing permits in some of our more high-priced communities. Should Congress, in your opinion, prioritize certain uses of CDBG funds? And if so, which ones?
That's absolutely right. So I think that they should in these really high rent places, right? So there was a conversation earlier saying that, well, more flexibility will help New York City to do the most important things. And I think that's wrong. It will allow New York City to do the most important things, but it's already allowed to largely. And more flexibility allows communities that don't want to do the right thing to continue not doing it. Cupertino, California, where Apple is headquartered, a few years ago, they used their CDBG to build sidewalks. Now they have Apple there. They can tax as much as they need to. I don't think 70% of the shoes on that sidewalk are low and moderate income shoes.
Mr. Firth, I appreciate your time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of this hearing. Let me thank everybody for participating. One of the reasons I'm so thankful is that I think that we have a chance to do something significant that will make a difference all over this country. And that is because I think many of us have some very similar ideas on the updating that we need to do. And so I'd like to also thank our witnesses. You've been very, very helpful. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. And I ask all witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to email address provided to your offices. I would also like to submit for the record a statement to the Housing Subcommittee on behalf of the State Community Development Agencies and the Council of State Community Development Agencies. So without any further reasons, we will now adjourn.